Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Sonship Review Part 8, and this is session 62. All right, now we just went through verses 11 and 12, and we were looking at all that. I just want to say that when you look at, through their fall, salvation has come to the Gentiles to provoke Israel to jealousy. Why in the world would Paul be interested in provoking Israel to jealousy? I mean, I just have to set this up because I'm going to ask you a question. Another question. Sorry, that was a question, wasn't it? Why is he interested in provoking Israel to jealousy? Because he wants them to get in on the same salvation the Gentiles are in on, right? Not only that, but look, he says, if the fall of them is rich to the world, and diminishing them rich to the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? Which means what? Yeah, he is still dedicated to doing with them what he was always going to do. So verses 11 and 12 are meant to produce that kind of thinking in us that God is not finished with Israel forever. I know we've talked about that a lot of times. Everything, because they're not going to get their fullness until all the covenants and promises are all fulfilled. And he's going to have to come back and finish that up. So those verses are meant to get that generated in our thinking. Verse 13. For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. All right, now I have to say something here. It's going to sound odd at first, but I think I'm right. So here it is. When he's writing the book of Romans, he's already writing to a Gentile assembly in Rome, right? So why does he come along in verse 13 and say, for I speak to you Gentiles? Isn't that who he's been speaking to? Here's what I understand about this. I think you'll see this clearly as we move down in the next several verses. This is not just talking about saved Gentiles in Rome. He is now saying something about Gentiles across the board. Not just saved Gentiles, but just Gentiles. And so when he says here, for I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. Now, Paul is magnifying his office, not himself. But when he says, I'm the apostle to the Gentiles, why have that in the middle of a discussion about Israel's fall and diminishing and all that? Why bring that up? I mean, I know he is informing them in Rome about what's happening here, but okay, there's probably a lot of talk about him not being a true apostle. Is that what you were going to say, Linda?
Not exactly, but no, I don't remember.
No, you don't remember what it was?
That he does have the power or authority that nobody else has.
All right, that he now has the authority as an apostle to say the things that he's saying and do the things that he's doing. All right, but there's something else. All of that is right, and
maybe he's reassuring the Gentiles, since he's been talking about the Jews and all that for so long, he's reassuring them that he is their apostle.
okay, reassuring the Gentiles that he is their apostle. All of that is right. And I think all of that plays in to the one more step that I want to take that. And that is, look, we just got through reading that all of that was to provoke Israel to jealousy. Jealousy of who? The Gentiles. And now, if Israel is going to learn what has happened to them, their stumbling, their fall, their diminishing, if they're going to learn about that, there's only one place they can go to learn what has happened to them. And it's not Peter, James, and John. It's the apostle of the Gentiles. In other words, this thing has swung so much now. In order for Israel to learn what has happened to them, they got to go to the guy who is the apostle to the Gentiles. Do you realize that's going to do one of two things? It's either really going to establish what Paul said is happening is true, or it's going to make you really mad. It's made them mad. Look, that is offensive, isn't it? We got to go to the apostle of the Gentile. But look, this whole thing is that Paul is trying to establish, you guys, if you're going to get what you really need, you're going to have to start copying the Gentiles, not the other way around. What was it like before? If you were a Gentile and you were a proselyte, you were a convert to Judaism,
You still had to get your blessing through.
you know what? And what? How were you treated as part of the Jewish assembly?
Like slaves.
You know what? You were second class, weren't you? That probably, if it were that good. It was, you know what? You were kind of on the outskirts. You were never really considered part of this main deal. This is a big change for them to now have to swallow their pride and say, we got to now do what the Gentiles are doing. We got to copy what they're doing. We got to believe what they're believing. That's a big pill to swallow.
It's kind of like when Jesus was talking to the woman, you know, and called her the dog, and she said, "Yay, master." But you know, it's on the opposite end of that now. It's where the Jews are having to do the same to the Gentiles and to Paul.
That's right. I'm going to repeat that so that because they won't hear it, and then I'll have to hear it. That
Pride.
when she said, it is pride. It's like that illustration that you just gave when they were referring to the Gentile woman who was asked for help and said it's not right to give, you know, the meat to the dogs, and she was considered in that way as a Gentile, the way all Gentiles were. Now the shoe is on the other foot, so to speak. Not so much that the Gentiles are now superior to Israel, but now,
Head and they're behind.
yeah, I mean, now everybody's the same. That is difficult for an Israelite. So Israel is now going to have to respond to God the same way that Gentiles do. Now, you might, and someone might wonder, if Paul, we just said, is the apostle of the Gentiles, why is he spending so much time in synagogues talking to Jews? And when people ask that question, there's a couple of things. First of all, God gave a commission to go to the Jew first. And you know what that was about? Informing them about the change in the program. Else how would they know? So he has to inform them about it. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason is what? He not only wants them to know that there's been a dispensational change, but he is hoping that in the midst of him talking about this, some of these Jews are going to be saved. He has, remember, that's his heart's desire, is for Israel to be saved. So, Paul is provoking them to jealousy, and now here comes verse 14. Here's the other provoking. If by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. That's the issue that we were just talking about. And by the way, provoking to jealousy and provoking to emulation are not the exact same thing. One of those is them looking at what he's doing to Gentiles and saying, man, I sure wish that was happening with us. And now the provoking to emulation is, I need to do what they're doing. Kind of two sides of a coin, I guess you might say. Paul realizes and he knows and he's communicating the fact that God is not permanently finished with Israel. And he knows that they still have a fullness that's going to come out there in the future. And so now what Paul is going to do is he's going to begin posing some questions that are meant to get us thinking about Israel's fullness, which means God is one day going to return and complete everything that he started with them. So here's verse 15. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? While everybody wants to get on the casting away bandwagon, some folks forget there's a receiving end of that. That's the part I want us to focus on for a moment. Because if they got cast away, and they did, they will also be received again in the future. So, cast away, someone is going to read that. They didn't pay any attention a few weeks back when we went through this. I'm just going to remind you of it for the sake of getting it on the recording. But that casting away, crab synonyms. To cast conveys simply the idea of laying aside or putting something from oneself. Throw and hurl indicate a mode of action. What is not wanted is cast off. What is worthless or hurtful is thrown away. Cast is an indifferent action. Throw always indicates a dislike or contempt. Cast requires no particular effort. Look, that could be called cast away. That marker I just laid aside. It says it requires no particular effort. It amounts in general to no more than to let fall or go. To cast is to set aside. We don't use it that way because most of the way that we speak nowadays is not very precise. But the Bible is very precise because it is making sure that we get the doctrine right. So, just as we've learned before, there are two ways. Can something be cast away permanently? It can. Can it also be cast away temporarily? It can. And both of those get used in Romans chapter 11. So when he says that they have been, for if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, that is that temporary setting aside of Israel in which now the whole world is being offered the chance to be reconciled to God. And then he asks the question, what shall the receiving of them be? And that is indicating to us, well, he says, what will it be but life from the dead? In other words, God is going to accomplish everything He intended to accomplish with Israel once they have their fullness. And God has returned and completed everything with them. Now, Romans chapter, I think there was one other thing I was going to talk to you about there. I can't think of it. Okay. Verse 16. Now, you have to follow me on this verse. Because now Paul is about to introduce an illustration for the things that he had been talking about. From verse 16 on down toward the end of the chapter here, he's going to be, this is the illustration that he's going to use. For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. Now, at first, I was going to have us read this whole passage because it's going to talk about two different trees, an olive tree and a wild olive tree, and some branches that get broken off and some branches that get grafted in, and then those branches getting broken off and other branches getting grafted back in. But instead of just reading all of that, here's what I thought we would do to best understand the illustration, because to my thinking, if we don't get verse 16 right, we won't understand this illustration right. Here's why this is important. I'm going to say this 2 or 3 times as we go through this. Maybe 9 or 10 times, okay? This illustration about the trees being, branches being broken off and branches being grafted in is not about anyone's salvation. Branches being broken off are not about anyone losing their salvation. Branches being grafted in is not about anybody being saved. Not Gentiles and not Israelites. This is not about salvation. That's why it's important to understand verse 16. There is a principle that is being set forth here that is laying the groundwork to demonstrate that not only God returning one day and fulfilling His program with Israel is the natural thing that should happen, but that it has already been provided for. That's what verse 16 is going to give us a principle for. So that when we understand verse 16, we'll start going 17, 18, 19, and on through this illustration, and you'll understand it's not impossible for God to come back and complete His program with Israel. In fact, it is the most natural thing that ought to have happened, and it will happen because God has already provided for it to happen. All right, now having said that, let's work our way through verse 16. And I think the easiest way to do this is let's first identify the terms. So here we go. For if the first fruit be holy. What is the first fruit? When you think of first fruit, what do you think of? What comes to your mind?
Israel?
Of what?
Israel?
Israel, okay. That's true. This is something Israel should be familiar with. That's terminology. Did you say apples? Okay. All right. That's fine. That's fine. Jesus himself, all right. He's the first fruits of them that slept. Milt?
First fruit.
Yes.
First of anything.
Thank you.
It's the start.
Right. It is the first part of a harvest. That is a Jewish. By the way, those other things you were saying are all correct. Jesus is the first fruit. Not going to deny that. But look, it's the first part of a harvest. He was the first part of a resurrection harvest, right? But anyway, by the way, he wasn't the first one to rise from the dead. That's not what that was talking about. Because he raised Lazarus, didn't he? Yeah. He was talking about the parts to the resurrection, all right, itself. All right. Anyway, the first fruits, thank you, Milt. The first fruits is the first part of any harvest. So were the Jewish people, didn't they have a feast called first fruits? Absolutely. So he says, for if the first fruit be holy, stop again. All right, so let's just put them up here. We did it with those terms. I don't have it this way in your notes, but the first fruit is the first part of a harvest. When Norma says an apple, you know what? Is there going to be a first fruit if you're picking the fruit off an apple tree? Sure. And by the way, he's going to work backwards in this verse, but we'll see that. Now, if the first fruit be holy, what does holy mean? At its essence, generally set apart. And if you're going to get more specific, set apart for God's purpose, right? The purpose for which it was created. But there are some things, by the way, the vessels in the tabernacle. Remember, there were some things that were in there. Were you supposed to go into the tabernacle and grab one of those vessels and take it home and use it at the family picnic? Why? Because it was specifically set apart for a very specific purpose or function. And it was not to be utilized for other things. Right? Okay. So now we got the holy. For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. What is the lump? And don't go, I got this place right here on my shoulder. Every time it starts to raise, I get this lump. No. No, it's not the root. The lump. Think, what is the first fruits is the first part of a harvest. What is a harvest for? Doesn't matter what it is. It could be apples or it could be grain. It could be anything. But what is that harvest for? If you're having a harvest, what do you know took place before you had a harvest? You planted something. And why did you plant something? All right, because it's going to grow, because what's at the end of that you're hoping to get out of it? We're planting corn because one day we expect to do what? That's something we're going to eat. Now, look, for if the first fruit be holy, the lump, this is something that Israel would be familiar with. I know you're Gentiles, but look, the lump, that's the dough. That's the dough. It's the lump of dough that's made from the grain of the first fruit harvest. Now, could he have said the pie is also holy? He could have. But what he's talking about is in the first half of the verse, the first fruit in this instance is a grain harvest. And out of that, you're making a dough And that's the lump. They're working that, they're kneading that lump. Okay, these are technical terms. Lump, skosh. Okay. Now, so the lump, in other words, this grain has now been processed into something that's actually going to get used as in a food some way, right? Have you ever made homemade bread? Okay. And you knead that dough, that's the lump, okay. So, I'm just going to say it that way. So, here's the first part of the principle, because it gets followed by a colon. So, for if the first fruit be holy, if the first part of the harvest is set apart for God's purpose, then isn't it also true that the dough that is made from that first fruit harvest is also holy by extrapolation? I added those last two words. But is everybody following this principle so far? In other words, someone's making this, and they say, "Oh, what are you doing?" They say, "I got this lump of dough, and I'm making it up." And they go, "Oh, well, can we do something?" No, because this is going to be used for a specific purpose. Well, so you could say, this lump is holy. Well, what makes that lump holy? Because it's part of the first fruits, and that's holy. Right? There's things about the harvest that we could talk about here, but I don't want to get too far off track. Because there's the first fruits, the harvest, which is the main part, but there's also a part that comes in late. Does anybody remember what that's called? It's called the gleanings. Yeah, Mark got it. The gleanings. Do you know what they would do with the gleanings? Oftentimes, they would, they'd leave it, for the poor people to come in on the edges after the main harvest had been done, and they could come in. It was like the way they gave to the poor. They could come in and grab that for themselves. And that was the end harvest. All right, anyway, again, we're going to get off in the weeds if I keep going with that. For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. So without making this too difficult, if the harvest, if this first part of the harvest is holy, then the stuff that's made from it is also holy. Everybody gets that? That was easy, right? You're just wondering why it took me 10 minutes to do it. Okay. Now he's going to kind of back up from that. Because if if you're going to harvest it, if it's going to be the first fruit, it actually has to have fruit, right? Let's use Norma's apple tree. In order for you to have a first fruit harvest, there has to be apples on the tree, right? Or there is no first fruit. Okay, that's good, Milt. Now, here's the second part. And if the root be holy, now it's not talking about the fruit. If the root be holy, do I need to write that on the board? We all get what the root is, right? Okay. What sustains the plant? Whatever it is. The root. Okay. So if the root be holy, I'm just going to put it up here because we're going to apply that same principle. If the root is holy, so are the branches. What would make the branches holy? That's right, because they are a product of the root. And they're sustained by the root. Right? Everybody sees that principle. So we have, I don't know, you could call it a continuation principle. Bad term probably, I don't know, I'm just guessing up here about what to call it. But do you see it? But now this, I said, remember, it's going to kind of move backwards here, because before you ever have any fruit, which is going to make what's made from the lump is made from the fruit of that harvest. Before you ever have that, you have root and you have branches. And why is he going to that? Because suddenly now this is not a grain so much anymore. This is like a tree. We're going to go back to the apple tree. But in this case, it's not going to be an apple tree. Does anybody remember what kind of tree this is going to be? Not fig. Olive. It's going to be an olive tree. So there's an olive tree, and it's going to have branches. But if the root is holy, then that's going to extend to the branches, right? Okay. Now that we've got that down, let me why do I have that here? It's almost like I shoved this into the wrong spot. Remember when we talked about, look, let me just show it to you. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, and we talked about that, I had a cross-reference to that. Let me just give it to you here, 2 Corinthians. And all things are of God, who hath reconciled us to himself by Jesus Christ, and hath given to us the ministry of reconciliation. What is the ministry of reconciliation? What does it mean to be reconciled to God? Give me just a... okay. And literally, if you've been reconciled to God, what has happened to you? You've been saved, right? All right. And if he's given us the ministry of reconciliation, what is that? That's a ministry to... That's right. Bring others to Christ, right? Bring others to salvation. To wit, that God was in Christ reconciling the world unto himself. So this is the opportunity now that the world has. It's part of the riches, right? Not imputing their trespasses unto them, and hath committed unto us the word of reconciliation. And we're supposed to be telling other people about that. All right? So that cross, I know we didn't do it earlier. I don't know why I stuck it back over here. So I'm saying compare this now to Romans 9:22. What if God, willing to show his wrath and make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy? You have two kinds of vessels. The vessels of wrath, who would that be? The unbelieving. And the vessels of mercy? Look, well, actually, let me back up, because that's not exactly right. The vessels of wrath are those, they were unbelieving, but they were in Israel's program. At that change, the world the world is no longer vessels of wrath. Now the world is, in this dispensation of Gentile grace, we're all getting mercy, aren't we? Remember, he's not imputing their sins unto them. So now they're vessels of mercy, and that he might make known the riches of his glory and the vessels of mercy which he hath prepared unto glory. So while Israel lost her place as being, a favored nation with God, won't always be that way. She is going to be fulfilled and reach her fullness. Now, I don't know why I stuck that in there instead of over there where it should have been. Verse 16. We looked at that verse. I think we've got that down. That was the buzzer? It was. Okay, let me get somewhere with this so that we can actually see what this is about. Verse 17. Okay. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou... Now wait a minute. I showed you this earlier when he said, for I speak to you Gentiles. Remember, and I said he's not just talking to Gentile believers at the Church of Rome, but now he's just talking about Gentiles everywhere, just in general. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, that's you Gentiles, being a wild olive tree... I'm not going to be able to finish this. I do know where this is going, but now I'm remembering. I got to show you some other verses that are in connection with this. We've looked at some of them, but we didn't talk about some of the details. We're a wild olive tree. But remember I said there's two kinds of... The Gentiles. Gentiles are a wild olive tree. Israel has been plugged into a good olive tree. What's the difference between a good olive tree and a wild olive tree? Just talk off the top of your head.
One's in a, like an orchard or whatever.
Okay, one's like in an
taken
orchard.
care of.
Taken
The
care
other
of.
one's just striving on their own.
Okay. And what do you suppose would be the difference between those two trees?
One of them was actually purposely planted
Okay.
for a specific reason.
Okay.
The other one got planted from however.
Okay.
Johnny Apple.
And what do you think would be the result of that? One is cultivated.
Yes.
One is just out there on its own. One is cared for. One is not. One is pruned. Why go to the trouble? Why would someone go to the trouble to produce fruit? So probably the wild olive tree, it's either not producing very good fruit, if it's producing any fruit at all, with the idea that the cultivated, cared for, looked after, provided for olive tree will produce fruit. Right?
In its most potential.
That's to reach its potential. Here's Israel. Have they reached their potential yet? No. So here's what he's going to say. And if some of the branch, now remember this is coming right on the heels of, if the root is holy, so also are the branches. And if some of the branches are broken off, now, let me just identify the parts and we'll quit for today. Anybody guess who some of the branches, not all of them, some of the branches are broken off. Who are the broken off branches? Unsaved Israel. That's the branches that get broken off. If you get to thinking this is talking about a program, that's going to get you in trouble. If you get to thinking this is talking about individual salvation, that is going to get you in trouble. There's where these erroneous doctrines come from not identifying this correctly. Why only some of the branches are broken off? That's right. There are some believers, aren't they? It is true, the program got cut off for everybody, right? Well, if it was talking about the program, then it wouldn't be some of the branches would be broken off. It would have been all of the branches would have been broken off. So see, it's not talking about a program. If you think it's talking about a program, it looks like Israel's program is still going along to some degree. Now we know that's not right. And thou being us Gentiles, being a wild olive tree. And were we a wild olive tree? We're out there on our own? Was God doing anything to really cultivate? No? All right. We're grafted in among them, the branches that are left. We got grafted in among them. And with them partakest of the, this is important, the root and fatness of the olive tree.
And they survive.
So, how many Gentiles got grafted in? Well, be careful and wait. What is God doing with the what? See, that's why we're going to come back. He is reconciling the world. So you know what? Who's been on the outside all this time? And now they are going to get special, I don't mean special in the way Israel got it, like favored nation, but they are now going to be the recipients of God's goodness. There is going to be something done with us, isn't there? I mean, Paul's already called it riches. And there are things that are now available to us that were not available to us before. So let me end this session by saying this. This tree, when you get plugged into this tree, is God reaching down to us Gentiles who never had this before, and God reaching out and saying, I want to establish a relationship with you now. Are you following what I'm saying here? Because this tree is not Israel. If you think it's Israel, hey, look, they were branches, but they're not the root. The tree is not Israel, and the tree is not the church. The tree is not the body of Christ. The tree is God's cultivating care and attention. In a little bit, He's going to call it His goodness. We are now partakers of His goodness. We were out here, but we were in wild olive tree, and we couldn't produce any fruit that was acceptable to God. But as soon as He plugs us in to His tree, because the root is holy, guess what? So are the branches. And if God ever takes you out of that, it doesn't matter. You can't produce anything that's acceptable to Him anymore.
So the wild olive tree and this part is the saved Gentiles?
No, just Gentiles.
All
All the Gentiles. And so now God plugs these Gentiles in. Look, if you're part of the little flock, you just didn't get broken off. But if you're Gentiles who were aliens from the commonwealth, without hope and without God, if you're far off, if you're that, God says, look, okay, take all of you Gentiles, and I'll and I'm going to put you over here into the tree of my goodness. But He's going to warn you and say, don't get to thinking that that's permanent. Because one day, there are branches that are going to get broken off of this, and I'm going to put the original branches back in. Do you see where this is going? God's not finished with Israel. Just because He is now dealing directly with Gentiles and showing them His goodness, it doesn't mean that you're in here forever. So He's going to give you a warning. Don't boast against the branches that got broken off. Don't be high-minded. Don't get to thinking that you're so good that you have replaced them. He said, because these branches can get broken off, and these other branches are going to come back in, and God's going to complete what He was doing with them. You see where this is going? Okay, anyway, we'll do this verse by verse. It's an important illustration. It'll be the thing that takes us the most time in what we're looking at to finish the chapter. But once we get it, what I'm counting on is that this is the part of the Scripture that will work in us to produce the right kind of thinking, that when anyone ever comes along with a clever argument and says, we're Israel, let me show you a verse, this thing will come right back to your mind and say, that's not how Paul talked about it. This is how Paul talked about it right here. Okay, so let's have prayer and we'll be done. Father, thank You for Your goodness to us and giving us Your Word. And that is the thing that renews our thinking and causes us to think about things exactly the way You do. And we want that to be working in us so that as we prepare to get back into the education, all of these issues will be solved for us. We'll settle them once and for all and move on into the doctrine that is meant to conform us to the image of Your Son. And we look forward to that in Jesus' name. Amen.